Great. So if you're here to learn about relational project management, then you're in the right place. And by that, we essentially mean putting people at the center of project and program management. What we discussed today has very broad applicability, whether you're working in central government, local government, in arm's length bodies, or indeed in the third sector. And it's all about putting people at the center, and that being an incredibly important part of actually getting the job done. For it's not enough just to rely on processes, project plans, spreadsheets. Strong relationships are absolutely key, and I'm sure many of you listening today will know all about that. Our team are very experienced at delivering projects and programs both at a local level, at a central government level, but also acting as the bridge between. But we approach this with a real sense of humility. We don't have all the answers, and we're very much still learning as we go ourselves. So the fact that we've got people listening who will be able to post questions is very, very useful to us as well. And I will tell you how to do that now. So don't worry about taking any pictures of any slides that we share. We will be sharing those at the end, or sorry, in a follow-up email along with our report on which this is all based. We're also recording this, and we'll make a recording available by email as well. So with all that, let's get going. So John, really good to see you. And I wonder if you could just start by telling us what relational project management is.
Yeah, hello again, Andrew, and delighted that so many people can join us on this webinar. So as Andrew says, we're sort of approaching this with a sense of humility. So questions from you would be brilliant, and any follow-up feedback would be grand as well. So as Andrew sort of already put it, simply put, relational project management puts people, human relationships, at the center of projects. So the relational in the relational project management refers to relationships. And I suppose conventional approaches to project management, so many of you will be trained in Prince 2 or Agile, they tend to emphasize processes, so structuring and organizing projects. And all that is great, it's necessary and it's good. But I suppose relational project management is a response to that in a sense of a realization that it's actually relationships that make and break good projects. And so processes are absolutely vital, as I've said, but they're secondary to people. So I've got a diagram I'm just going to show you, which sort of says that a little bit. And usually when you read about project management, there's three sort of factors that people think about. So time, scope, and cost. You know, am I going to meet my milestones? Am I going to meet my deadlines? To that, we want to add people, because as I've said, that really is what makes or breaks the success of a project. So relational project management is all about the things you can do to establish and embed the conditions to get the best out of people. So it recognizes that successful outcomes rely on respectful, healthy relationships within a team, and that sort of belief in solving difficulties. And so the key is to have a whole project team and stakeholders on side working for the same outcome, focused on their tasks and enjoying themselves. So this sort of realization came from a decade or more of project management that we've been involved in. And it also has a sort of underpinning ethos, which is very similar to some of that you get in public services around relational practice, which is an approach that's becoming widely used in social care, in teaching, in nursing, and it promotes relationships with families, colleagues, partners, patients as the key to successful services. And at this point, I just want to give a little nod to the work of the Leeds Relational Practice Centre, who work in social care, and I've done quite a lot of work with, and I know some of those colleagues have joined us. So working with them, I've learned a lot. So Laura, perhaps we can ask you to kind of follow up on what I've just said and say, why is relational project management so suited to local government?
Yeah, thanks, John. It's really interesting to hear the explanation of what it is, and it really resonates with me, particularly having worked in local government previously to coming to Mutual Ventures. It probably sounds really obvious that it's all about relationships, And that is so true in local government, which is all about people, you know, from the cabinet at the very top to the senior officers, the people on the front line, to those service users and kind of everyday citizens. So I think the approaches that you need to make things work in local government just fundamentally rely on relationships. So where people are stretched, which they often are, it's really easy to just revert to process and think, we need to achieve these milestones. Why isn't this happening? Why isn't this information coming through? And yeah, revert to your project plan, but that doesn't help to kind of unblock things or understand what's really going on for people. And often you're asking people to do things on top of their day jobs. So relationships are fundamental then, because people will often in local government, because they are motivated by serving people, will go over and above, but not if those relationships aren't strong and they're not in place and there isn't kind of shared respect. And that's what relational project management, I think, fundamentally is based on. Yeah, even from the basics of putting together a cabinet report, you need input from so many stakeholders to collaborate to get that together. That can itself be a project, really, when you think about it. And so, yeah, there's so many key elements and key contributors that you need to share the responsibility, but also share the kind of understanding of why people might take a bit longer or things might be a bit more challenging, and work together to solve those problems. I don't know if you've got anything to add.
Yeah, so Laura, I think that's really interesting. Sorry, I was on mute there. First person to make that mistake. So I think that's really interesting, and for councils in particular, their experience of dealing with the pandemic and the fact that to get through that, relationships through Gold Command and a whole range of other mechanisms, relationships were everything for councils. And I think a really key thing now is trying to maintain those lines of communication. And just certainly, I know from our perspective, the councils that we were involved in supporting during the last couple of years, the relationships, actually, the individual relationships between the council chief exec, the chief exec at the NHS, the third sector leaders, was really critical. So, and I think it's just proven that it's a really good way of doing things. Now, having made a really strong case for it, John, I wonder if I could ask you and play devil's advocate a bit, because I think for some people, this will all sound a bit fluffy and, you know, sure, relationships, but, you know, as long as I've got a good project plan, that's good enough. I mean, does this actually get stuff done?
I think that's a really important question, because yeah, I suppose it's a criticism that could be leveled, but actually, do you get stuff done? Yes, you get stuff done, because it's not about being sort of soft or taking your eye off the ball. So as I said before, you still need process, you still need strong strategic operational governance structures, you still need project plans, you still need milestones and risk registers. But it's about understanding that as well as that, good relationships are vital for getting stuff done. So think about it. I mean, none of us respond to project plans, to being sort of told what to do in the same. We don't live like that. We're sort of emotional creatures. We need to understand each other, and we need to know that we're working together, and we need to know that what we're doing is good and right. So I think good relationships and focusing on that, it's motivating for people. So people want to do their best for you and for their team. And without an approach that values relationships, the temptation can be to avoid difficult conversations or leave it too late before addressing. And where projects fail, it's because those conversations haven't happened, or they don't happen early enough. So relational project management is not an excuse to tolerate underperformance. It certainly doesn't do that. But it starts by looking for the root of the issue and treating each other with respect, with honesty, with humanity. And if a resolution isn't there, or you have the wrong person for the job, then as a project manager, you still need to act decisively. And that's about being honest with each other. It's about being honest with that person who's probably not enjoying themselves either. And it's about being honest with everybody in the team and them being honest with you. So it really is, I suppose it's a lens through which to look at project management, which at the moment is very process and structure orientated, but without those relationships, it's more difficult to get stuff done.
Yeah, I completely agree, John. And just, I was going to give an example of my own there, but before I do, I realized I omitted telling our watchers that they can submit questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So apologies for that. I'm afraid because there are a lot of people on this webinar, we haven't enabled your ability to ask questions verbally, but please do use the Q&A function, as that's going to be really important. So just in terms of why this is important, conversations I have with the councils we work with. So Mutual Ventures, we're a consultancy, and we work with public services. And the conversations I have with our clients lead me to believe that the kind of era of big consultancies coming in and just kind of following a process relentlessly, regardless of everything else, is kind of done. The world is much more complex now. All of the easy efficiencies, if there is such a thing, that the councils can drive out, are all gone. So it's very, very complex now, and this makes the need to have good relationships, and for a consultancy like us, and for all the different partners to act really as human beings with each other, has become ever more important. And that's the feedback that I'm getting, certainly with external organizations like us working with councils, but also within councils and between councils and other organizations. The best relationships we see, if we're supporting central government to deliver a program in partnership with councils, there's always a really good relationship between the central government public servants and the local government public servants. And that I don't think that's always been seen as a really critical thing. But I think particularly now, when there's so much pressure on both central and local government, those relationships and building up that common understanding is so important.
Shall I come in with an example of somewhere how kind of understanding relationships is really critical to delivering a project? So I worked on a project, it was quite some years ago, and I won't say the organization, but we had a good project plan. We had a good, we had our milestones, we had our risk, all those good things. And we were progressing through it. And it turned out there was a bit of an underlying thing, a bit of a blockage. And without understanding the relationships, you wouldn't know this. And it turned out that the sort of leader of the project and his number two were both ex-forces employees. So they're both in the army. One was in the army, one was in the RAF. And it turned out that the senior one had been a wing commander, and the second one had been a group captain. Now, what that means is that one outranked the other in the army, in the forces, but in the project, it was the opposite way around. And they couldn't cope. I mean, the number two couldn't really cope with being underneath somebody who he'd been senior to in his other life. And what that meant was that things weren't getting done. So you had to have it took a while to understand that. And I didn't understand how, the forces are structured, but having a conversation with them, you realized that this was a real problem. And so, far from sort of being fluffy and nice, in the end, in conversation, they both couldn't stay on the project. So the number two had to leave. And, I spoke to him about it, and he joked to me, he said, "You're now off my Christmas card list." But he understood, he was sensible and he understood the situation. But that was really necessary to get things done. And without understanding the relationships, you wouldn't get to that point, and you'd have a project that wasn't delivered properly.
Yeah. Laura, do you want to add anything in on this?
Yeah, I think similarly, I was just thinking about how you can also deliver a project to a project plan, tick all your milestones, and it actually still not feel like a successful project. And that's because those relationships aren't in place throughout, and people do the work, but actually the change hasn't happened that needs to happen. And I think I found that quite a lot when I was working to implement kind of IT systems in adult social care and children's social care. A lot of people would not necessarily see the value of those systems. So I think what we had to do, I guess, in those processes was that real kind of engagement throughout to understand kind of the roles and responsibilities. So the project management process there was obviously important, but as I said, like it was a successful project, and then it's whether people actually use the solution at the end. And I think the only way we kind of won hearts and minds with the people involved there was to really understand their motivations, how it would actually help the citizens that they were serving, and why it was important from that perspective, to get people to kind of really engage and think differently, I guess, about IT in that way, and why it might be useful in their particular area. But I think without that kind of joint ownership as well, and that, as John says, I mean, like challenging the individuals, I particularly you know, there were a couple of people that were more challenging, especially financial officers that might have wanted to see immediate savings for something that should, you know, obviously IT can often be used as a thing to remove individuals from processes, but that's not what it was about. And it was much more about how we could serve citizens better, which I think is where you could get buy-in. But often with IT, that isn't what happens, and that's why a lot of the time those solutions just get left on the shelf, I guess. I don't know if you've got anything, Andrew, in terms of specifics.
No, I think we've covered that one off.
Well, I think, John, it would be really good to understand what you think, as more of an expert than me, in terms of what it means to manage a project relationally.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. And I'm definitely not more of an expert than you. I mean, we're going for a humility in this webinar. So so the question being, what does it mean to manage a project relationally? Now, I've shared a question which I'm going to use to answer that on my screen. So I think this question you've got in front of you is key to practicing relational project management. So this is the question that as project managers and as individuals on a team, you should be asking yourself all the time. Is the nature and quality of my relationships helpful to achieving the goals of the project? And then sort of allied to that, if not, what am I going to do about it? So if you've got a piece of paper in front of you on this, write that question down, because I think that's the one, if you're going to take one thing from that webinar and it's going to resonate in your head, it should be that question, I think. So we've already talked about the importance of sort of honesty and humility and humanity alongside the processes and structures, but relational project management is all about, so you've got your sort of the principles of project management apply in the same way. If you need a vision, you need process, you need structure, but you also need that relationships stuff. And it's relational project management brings tried and tested tools, including sort of techniques for building that relationship, check-ins, which we'll talk a bit more about in a moment, stakeholder mapping, and all those sort of guidelines about how to have difficult conversations. And so managing a relational project relationally is about focusing on those relationships, but it doesn't replace, as I've said many times now, it doesn't replace those sort of things that you also need: risk registers, project plans. It's designed to work with that, you know, with those approaches that you've learned, such as Prince 2. But it provides a sort of lens to look through things, which is projects based on the centrality of human relationships. Ultimately, that's what makes or breaks a project. So where teams work together and relationships are good is where you get the best results. So managing relationally is like that. So I'm going to show another slide here, which is a sort of summary of relational project management as a whole. And if you look at the report on our website, we'll send a link to it after this. this is a sort of summary of it. So as you can see, relational project management and that question in the middle. On the left-hand side are some of the key principles, which are common to all project management processes. And on the right, you've got some of those practical things that you can do that we're going to talk a bit more about now.
Great. So I'll start, John, by talking a bit about building relationships. So that list there, just as a reminder, had building relationships, understanding the team with check-ins, respecting colleagues at all levels, shared accountability, communication, recognizing the impact of change. And building relationships, I think, is obviously what we're talking about today, but what does that actually mean? So I think the first thing is that first impressions really, really do matter. You know, be on time, you know, do your homework, be prepared for that first meeting, because first impressions, we're human beings. This is what we're talking about today. And if somebody has a bad first meeting with you or seems uncaring or not prepared, you're going to find it very difficult to get over that first impression. The second thing is about rapport. So anybody can turn up to a meeting and just work their way through an agenda. But thinking about the way the world is now, people don't have, usually working remotely especially, don't have travel time between meetings to kind of decompress from their previous meeting and start to get ready for their next meeting. So that kind of gear change that a person needs to go through needs to happen in the meeting almost. So we always try and spend a bit of time at the beginning of a meeting, having a chat about something that's not part of the agenda, that's not part of it, because that helps build rapport, helps people relax, helps people tune out from their last meeting and get used to hearing you speak, to your voice, and you know, gets them in a good place. The next thing, and we've used this word a lot, is about being humble, being honest about what you know and what you don't know, and recognizing the experience of others. So it's about knowing your role as well. So from our perspective, we're consultants who have, I would say, excellent technical expertise and some subject matter expertise, but we're never going to know as much as a frontline social worker about social care. You know, we're never going to know as much about somebody working in youth services, about how those are delivered and the challenges that they face. So knowing your role within a meeting and within a relationship is really important. And it's okay not to know the answer to things. We've got no time at all for hero leaders who feel like they need to have the answer to everything. And if they don't have the answer, they just make something up in order to expose any sort of weakness. That's not how you build a genuine relationship. So it's really important to be honest and authentic. Some very, very practical things. And this is something I learned early on in my career, and that's to have a really good relationship with the gatekeepers. So the people who are managing your main client's diary, for instance, really important to show that person respect as you would as a human being, but they have a lot more power than I think some people realize, and they are often not afraid to use that power as well. So that's important. And then the final bit about just building relationships, and this is something John says a lot, don't be afraid to pick the phone up. I think we're terrified of the phone these days. You know, people can do, you know, video conferencing back to back. A lot of people sit with their screen off. Face-to-face meetings are more rare, but that's the kind of ultimate way of doing it. But pick the phone up to somebody, and it actually, when you do it, it's a reminder of a much more intimate form of communication than I think that we've got used to recently. So just some little thoughts about building relationships. Laura, do you want to just say a little bit about what we mean by understanding the team with check-ins?
Yeah, so I think you touched on it a bit, Andrew, in terms of kind of at the beginning of meetings, just really finding out how people are and starting with a conversation as opposed to just jumping straight into the business. And I think, you know, if applying a purely project management approach, you would do check-ins, but you would just be looking at what are the milestones, where are we up to? You wouldn't be thinking, how are these people, how's it going for them personally? And I think particularly in local government, or in the health sector, people have got really challenging roles where, you know, they're working with individuals who have really complex lives, and it's you know, draining and challenging for them individually. So let alone, you know, if personally they might have something going on. And I think check-ins are just really important on an individual basis as well. So that can be when you're just having a one-to-one, maybe with project manager in the local government or organization, to just see how it's going for them that day. And it may be that things are going quite badly and you don't necessarily have to speak to them right there and then, and it would be better to reschedule. And I think you only pick that stuff up by really giving the time to ask how people are at the beginning of the meeting, and you know, being interested in the answer, so actively listening, not just saying how are you, and it is quite different to putting that in an email where people, you know, feels quite impersonal. So I think, as you say, picking up the phone, or doing it via a video call, but people can be a bit teamed out. So I think phone calls are a really good method now, particularly as we're not face to face with people often. But yeah, they're really just a simple method to help understand what's going on, and get to know people better. And as you do get to know them better, it can be more conversations about, you know, your children or the gig that you're at the weekend, and just helps to build that rapport. As you say, that's really important. And as John said, that motivates people to do stuff for the project, for you, because they respect and kind of value you as well. And you can also do them at the end of meetings, just to make sure, because it, you know, particularly if it's maybe a larger meeting talking about a difficult subject matter, people can go through a change process just during the meeting and feel quite differently by the end. So it's quite helpful to just check in to make sure everyone's still on the same page and nothing has changed.
Yeah, and I think jumping in on something on the relationships point that we made earlier, I think it's really, so if you start a new project, maybe 3 months, 6 months, 12-month project, whatever, the first thing you want to do is to get to know people. And I'd say go and have a coffee if you can, or have a, you know, if it has to be a Zoom call, have a Zoom call. But I think when you have that call and make the effort, because people will be flattered and people will be interested in you because they might not know you, and ask them how they are, ask them, find out a bit about them, have a human conversation. So don't just talk about the project plan or what their milestones are or what their expertise is. I would say, if you ask me the question, what's the most important thing to do in a kickoff meeting with a client or at the start of a project, I would say it's to build a relationship. It's not to, I wouldn't say it's to get all those sort of technical things in place. I would say if you don't do anything else, just get to know them a bit, because you can always have another meeting, you know. And I think that investment is a really important thing. Yeah,
I completely agree with that, John. Sometimes we're in so much of a rush to get through the agenda to get started that actually we're not really prepping the ground for what might be quite a difficult project, and that initial building of relationships is so important. John, do you want to say something about respecting colleagues at all levels, or maybe shared accountability as well?
Yeah, I will do. And just quickly to answer just to go back to that point about meeting people and getting to know them, building a relationship. I suppose I'm not thinking about this in a sort of very functional, get your project done, you know, this is the efficient way to deliver a project. I suppose the way I like to work is I'm genuinely interested in people, and, you know, I'm genuinely interested in, you know, making sure that they have a good experience of a project, as well as I want to have a good experience of a project. So it's not sort of pure project interest, the reason that you have these conversations. It's because we're sort of human and we kind of get on together, and, you know, that's something that we need to do in a sort of work environment as well as a personal environment. Respecting colleagues at all levels. So when you go into a sort of project environment, there may well be a governance structure. There's probably formal systems of hierarchy and accountability. So maybe there's a chief executive, maybe there's some project officers, you know, at the other end of the sort of hierarchy, if you like. Relational project management reminds us to respect everyone. So everyone might need slightly different treatment in terms of how you interact or your method of communication. but it's really important to recognize, as you said earlier, everybody's expertise, wherever they are. And one tool that's useful for that, and we can provide more information on, is stakeholder mapping. It's really useful to do at the start of a project. So you map, their impact on a project and their knowledge of the project, and then you work out where they fit in and what that relationship needs to be like. And then on the shared accountability point, I think shared accountability is almost like the best thing you can do in a project is to build an environment where it gets the best out of people. And that's not just about the project manager top down saying, do this, do that, do that. It's ideally about everyone on a project kind of having a sort of broad sense of what needs to do, understanding the dependencies with each other, so that everybody holds each other to account and everybody realizes that actually, if I do this, this affects this person. And because there's those relationships and bonds, then you want to do well for your colleagues, as well as to deliver your piece of work and as well as to deliver the project. So it's about creating an environment where people are sort of passionate about what they do and have each other's back as well. Where there's slippage in the project managers, should be wary of kind of there being any sort of scapegoating or ganging up on each other. That's not what it's about. So it's about creating a sort of shared sense of responsibility.
Yeah, no, I think those are extremely interesting insights. And just on the respecting colleagues at all levels, I don't know if other people have seen it, but there's a good billboard advert. I can't remember what it's for. It's for, I think it might be for an insurance company or something, but it's a quote from Angela Hartnett, who's a very famous chef who trained under Gordon Ramsay. And her quote is that the thing I learned from Gordon Ramsay, you won't believe this, is to be polite and nice to everybody, regardless of where they've come from or where they are. And I don't know if you've ever seen Ramsay on TV, but he's certainly rude to staff and customers. So I think a key thing, John, as well for all of that is to not just say it, but to do it as well. It's all very well starting off with the intention to respect colleagues at all levels, but actions speak a lot louder than words. Next on our list here is communication. Now, obviously, relationships, we all know personal relationships, work relationships, communication is everything. What can we say about that, Laura?
Yeah, no, I was just thinking as well that the shared responsibility or accountability bit is the way that I like to work as well. It just makes, as you said, John, it's about, some of this is about how we want to work with each other and what makes a job satisfying as opposed to just how things get done. But yeah, good communication, as you say, is essential within that. And it's not just about what's being communicated, but that is really important. So in terms of that being kind of clear but consistent, so everybody's getting the same information, nothing's going to be a surprise to one individual, because that is a real way to kind of derail a project if people aren't expecting things and they feel like they haven't been kept in the loop. So kind of one version of the truth. And I think it's regular because things do change often on projects, and I think everybody's okay with that if they're kept informed of it. But when they feel like they haven't been kept in the loop, that can be really, can feel isolating to people and disengage. But I think the method as well, I think like we've talked about, there's just different people respond differently to communication. Some people will respond really well to emails, others just don't have the time to go through their 100 emails daily. So for them, it's much better to have a quick call or even a text. And I think only by developing relationships, understanding people, can you really understand the best way to communicate with them. And that, linking into that stakeholder map, it's then the routes to communicate to those different stakeholders and what messages they need. So project management around it is also really important.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. So just moving on then, I want to talk a little bit about recognizing the impact of change. And I think this comes back to something John was saying earlier about just understanding where people, walk a few miles in your colleague's shoes, essentially. And that this is the best example I can think of this is, a number of years ago, we were doing a piece of work with a couple of district councils who were considering merging, or at least having a combined leadership team. Now, the kind of unspoken at the start truth of this was that actually some roles would be lost, and part of the rationale was actually to become more efficient. So some of the people working on the project were working on a project that may have actually ended up with them losing their post. So it was really important for us to just get that in our heads initially, so that we knew where people were coming from, and we were able to build a relationship with them from a position of understanding. I mean, any change program, there are going to be people who are really up for it. There are going to be people who are absolutely against it, and there are going to be people who just want to get on with their job with as little disruption as possible. You're never going to convince all of the people who are not up for it if you're going to convince any of them. And for the people who are really up for it, you might have trouble getting them to appreciate and to take seriously the real risks of this change as well. So you have to be thinking, when you're running a project and you're engaging with people, what it's like to be in their shoes, what are their motivations, where are they coming from? And I think those are important things in terms of building that relationship, because we're all humans and we all bring our own personal perspective and how it will impact us to a project as well. Now, before I want to just talk now about some scenarios, but before I do, Laura, John, is there anything you want to add in before we move on to some of our scenarios?
I think one of the things I would add in is just an appreciation of the importance of relationships and this approach when things go wrong.
Yeah.
So projects are fine. It's all easy when it's going right. The test is when things go wrong. And if you haven't invested in relationships and you haven't built you haven't had this sort of approach, then you risk derailing the project. And let me give you an example, which I'm sort of always slightly gives me the shivers, because it was such a difficult situation. So I was the main project manager on this big project, this sort of 18-month project, which was very high profile. It involved working with a council and working with the government, and the government was doing something to the council didn't really want to do, in response to a very sort of tricky situation of failure. And I'd spent quite a lot of time. I mean, I'd kind of done a lot of the things we've talked about here and built a relationship. And I got on very well with the chief executive, and he sort of trusted me. But there was all this tension underlying everything. And I was away for it was the day before my sister's wedding. I was on a train trip, and I got a call from one of the project officers who said, "Oh, I haven't done this." And I looked into it and I realized that's going to derail the project. That's going to mean a 3-month delay. And what am I going to do? And so what you can do in that situation is pretend it didn't happen, or you can try and make excuses, or you can do. But what I talked to Andrew about this, and he'll remember this. And we had a big discussion about this, on a train platform for sort of 20 minutes. And then I decided I'm going to phone the chief executive. I'm going to say, this is what's happened. We're going to plan what we're going to do with it. How we're going to try and mitigate this. But this is a problem. So I phoned him. He was on the way to a funeral. It couldn't have been a worse situation. And he said, I can't talk now, but I gave him the brief details and he was just very quiet. It was a Friday. I was going to my sister's wedding the next day, and it was just really, I was really anxious for the next sort of 24 hours. And then I got a text message from him, which he never really sent me text message, but he got a text message on Saturday evening saying, "Don't worry about it, mate. You've told me what's happened. We'll work it out." And it's just, I was sort of, oh God, thank goodness for that.
Yeah. Oh, I remember this one so well, John, and I remember that conversation, and I'm just, it's one of my favorite examples of, I think, doing the right thing. You know, if you think of, like, the example I always use are politicians. The politicians, when you see them, they've made a mistake. It's very rarely the mistake that does for them. It's the attempt to gloss over it, to cover it up. And if you're going to have a genuine relationship with people, you need to have to be ready to be honest, because actually that example you give, and I know this for a fact, that relationship strengthened because of the immediate honesty and upfrontness. And you know, the work we do, the work a lot of people on this webinar will do, is really difficult, and mistakes will be made. That's just a part of life, but it's how you actually address them. Do you try and cover them up? Do you try and gloss them over? Or you know, is there a timing thing that means this isn't a great time to actually make a mistake? But actually the lesson is that if it's a well-intentioned mistake and you're raising it with a plan to try and put it right, then our experience is that strengthens a relationship. And John, I think the reason that worked for you and in that situation was that you had built up relationship credit, let's call it that, with that client, where they knew that you were honest, they knew that you were trying to do the right thing at all times, and you certainly used some of that credit to kind of get past it. But if you had not no credit, it probably wouldn't have worked.
No, and I think it's one of the, it also, from my time, I used to work in retail for a while, and it reminds me of a sort of thing that a manager once said to me, which is when you get something wrong, provided you've got that relationship, but if you get something wrong with a client, they have a bad experience, and you solve it, and then they have a good experience, they're more satisfied than a customer who's had a poor relationship, a poor experience in the first instance. And I think that's maybe that's a bit of a stretch of an analogy, but I think we have to be honest with each other. We have to, do what we can to solve problems. And if people can see that you're genuinely trying your best, and there's no sort of fault on your side, then that's all you can do.
Okay. Laura, do you want to add anything before we move on to the scenarios?
Yeah, I was just thinking about how projects aren't straightforward, and so you, as John said, it's kind of when things are starting to go wrong, or there is an issue, that you kind of know if you've got those strong relationships or not. And I remember quite early in my career working with a children's social care team for learning disabilities and a health team to try and look to bring them together. I was very enthusiastic about this project and thinking, this is the right thing to do. But both kind of managers from the different organizations felt strongly that this might not be the right approach, or there's different ways of doing this. And I think as I worked more and more with them, established those relationships, I understood their perspectives, and that, being new and young in that environment, thinking this is the first time they've been through a change. But as you say, the change processes, especially in local government, are ongoing and happen all the time. And I think recognizing that and understanding that is really important. And yeah, we progressed through the project, and it was challenging, lots and lots of one-to-one meetings with those individuals to kind of get them on board and get sign up. So disengagement during the project, and then re-engagement again, which was really important. Especially as they're often, or in that project, they were kind of the key holders to getting to the members of the team, to speak about operational stuff. But what I thought was really telling, I guess, is when I left that role and I got kind of card from the children's social care manager to say, we haven't always seen eye to eye, but I've really respected your work and your commitment. And I think that is kind of a testament to the type of how important those relationships are, and how they do make a difference, even if you're not quite sure at the time how it's all going.
That's a really good example, Laura. Thank you. Right, we're going to just do some quick fire scenarios here. John, I don't know, do you want to just share your screen? And just to say to everybody, there's almost 100 people listening here, and we haven't got had any questions yet. So I'm hoping that's because we're covering everything that you might have wanted to ask. So, right, quick fire round here. So this scenario, one of your work stream leads is ahead of the others and is now causing irritation to other work streams by trying to get involved in their work. Sorry, I jumbled that. How do you manage this? So essentially you've got someone who's really ahead and is trying to get involved in everybody else's stuff.
I guess I would just try and be positive about the contribution that they've made. Great that they're enthusiastic, but think about how we could channel that into kind of maybe their work or their areas, and remind them of kind of the roles and responsibilities and why it's really important that everybody's part of the project. So I guess going back to some of those fundamentals about shared accountability and why it's really important that there's ownership across kind of the work streams.
Yeah, I would say as well, one of the things I like to do with people is to ask them to reflect on the impact their behavior is having on others. You know, if you can see it's irritating them, then they might be able to see that as well. But actually, you know, is that just them feeling better about themselves being ahead, or is that actually causing others to not be able to do their work so well?
Yeah, I would agree with that. So first of all, I'd sit down and have a conversation with this person and see what's going on. I mean, are they bored? Have they not got enough to do? Do they want to get involved? I mean, this might be a kind of potential resource that you're just not using, you know, that the project isn't using well enough. So I think you just want to find out what's under this, because it's great that they're doing their work so well, but as Andrew, you've just said, you need to reflect on the impact on others. But we all want a sort of satisfying job, and that, you know, they should be no different.
And the things we're saying seem really obvious, but I think in a lot of projects I've worked in, there wouldn't be anything done about this. It would just be ignored. You know, so this is relational project management requires effort, and it's about correcting little things as well as waiting for big disasters to happen. So thanks, John. Let's move on to the next one.
Yeah.
So one of your workstream leads is, again, disruptive, but in a different way. They're ignoring the plan and just doing their own thing. What do you do about that?
So I think this almost, when you talked about the impact of change, Andrew, and we've often said it, is you've got the sort of three groups of people: the people who are really enthusiastic about change, the people who really don't like it at all, and the people who don't really care. And I think from this is the people who don't really like what's going on. So I think the way to address this again is to have a conversation with them and find out what's going on, and find out what the problem is, why they don't like the plan, why they don't like what's going on in the project, and kind of picking under, because it might be that there's personal things going on, it might be that there's other professional dynamics, you know, outside the project that you don't know about. And so I think it's about, you know, I would start by giving everybody the benefit of the doubt until I know otherwise. You know, and ultimately, as I said earlier, this is about, you know, it's about having good relationships, but it's about getting the project done. So if this person isn't right for the project or isn't the right person, then you're going to have to act decisively on that at some point.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I think that giving people the benefit of the doubt, and just going back to one of the things I said earlier about walking a few miles in someone else's shoes, just to understand why, because nobody wakes up in the morning determined to be disruptive or unproductive. Everyone's trying to achieve something that they feel is the right thing or a good thing for them. So walking those few miles in their shoes, I think, is an important place. Laura, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, and I think just they may not understand from their perspective why this is important or why it's going to make the difference, and maybe you just haven't essentially sold it to them in the right language or in the right way that they understand. So, but yeah, without having that conversation,
yeah,
you can understand that, because as you say, I don't think anyone's intentionally disruptive. I think, you know.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and I don't think I think there are very few people react, regardless of what they're bringing to a project, or what baggage, what preconceived views. Very few people react badly to being asked how they are and why they feel a certain way about things. It's a really difficult thing to react badly to, because it's such an open question.
And this brings to mind a example that I was involved in, where I worked with a project, and on the other organization we were working with, their side, their project manager changed, and I was working with her, and she just sort of fallen behind, and she was being a bit awkward and a bit disruptive, and it just didn't, it wasn't working. So after, it took me probably an embarrassing amount of time to do this, but after a couple of weeks, I sort of sat down with her and said, well, and actually you spent proper time with her, you realized there hadn't been a proper handover. She wasn't really uncomfortable with what she was doing. So what we worked together and decided that actually she should come and shadow me for sort of a week to some of these meetings and actually work out the dynamics, work out who's important. And we got on really well, and it was a really successful relationship after that point. So I think these things can be turned around. Sometimes they can't, but as I said, I always start by giving the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. So, John, if you could just wouldn't mind on sharing your screen there. I think we actually covered that with that last one there, just in your last example. So I don't want to overwhelm people with different scenarios. So look, it just falls on me now. I'd like to give everybody back probably 5 minutes of their hour to get ready for the next meeting. So it's been great, John and Laura. Many thanks for your thoughts and ideas, and most importantly, your real experience of this. And look, I think ultimately projects are about people, whether they're a technology solution or an organizational change solution or a structural solution. It's all actually about how it impacts people at the end of the day. And what we've been talking about today isn't rocket science, but it is amazing how often these fundamental truths that projects and programs are about people are forgotten, and how often people find it comfortable to hide behind plans, Excel spreadsheets, Gantt charts, and processes. And I just want to finish with a challenge for everybody, and that's to, at some point this week, instead of writing an email, pick the phone up to somebody and start getting into that habit of building relationships again, real relationships. And try as well, when you're having meetings, to just have that little bit of chat at the start, not about the project, just to ask somebody how they are. And there's plenty of ways of doing that, where you can see what someone's background is, or you can see, well, if you know where somebody's from, what's been going on there. So try it out, and I'm sure that you'll feel really rewarded by it. So thank you very much again, Laura and John. Thank you everybody for joining. And as I said, we will be sending out the slides, which are actually part of our report largely, and then also sending out a link to the recording if you want to share this with any colleagues, and please do so, we'd be delighted. So thank you very much. And that's our contact details. You can follow us on Twitter, link to us on LinkedIn, or if you want to find out more about relational project management, we're at www.mutualventures.co.uk/RPM. Thank you very much. Goodbye.